Chapter 1, Sunday School. To understand the Onu Adventure books, I first have to explain this idea of Sunday school. So I grew up in a small town in the Midwest. Well, let me clarify that. I grew up in Marion, Ohio, which over the course of my life has had a population of 35 to 36,000. So Marion wasn't really a small town. But Marion felt like a small town because of, a big city like Columbus nearby, and primarily because of my parents. They were so invested in our community that they could hardly go anywhere without someone seeing them and stopping and talking to them. I mean, they were so well known, they'd even come visit us around the Columbus area, and they'd see people they knew. Go figure. Me, I'm nothing like that. I like living in a larger city and, going places where no one knows who I am. My parents were both Christians, and I don't mean the fanatical, in-your-face kind. I mean the sort that strives to be Christ-like and humbly tries to make the world a better place. One of the biggest investments my parents made in the idea of community was our local church. Growing up, back in the days when electricity was still new and there was no internet, our church had 4 weekly events: Sunday school, Sunday morning worship, Sunday night worship, and a Wednesday evening prayer meeting. Nowadays, with in-person church attendance trending way down, most churches are lucky if they get people to attend even a single service once a week. But back then, when I was growing up, each of these 4 church events helped shape me in several different ways. So let's start with the Sunday morning worship. This was the biggest service and production of the week, with the largest attendance. Basically, this one service is what people today would view as going to church. People would dress up and it was a big occasion. Then after that big Sunday morning service, we would go out to eat, spend some time with our family, relax, do those kind of things, maybe even take a nap on Sunday afternoon. I used to call that a Nazarene nap because the church I went to was a Nazarene church. I'm sure lots of people did that. And then on Sunday night, we'd have a smaller church service. And then midweek on Wednesday, we would have another service. And the interesting thing about those services is that we were just in every one of those events, we were being bathed in studying the Bible. We were hearing preaching on the Bible. We were hearing what God was doing in people's lives. Like on Wednesday night, that was a really cool service. We get together, we just sing a little bit. They'd even ask people, hey, what song do you want to sing? What hymn do you want to sing? And so people would just call out a number and we'd sing that song. And there'd be a time where we would pause in the service and just ask people for testimonies. And they would just stand up from their seat and tell folks what God had been doing in their lives, sometimes even that week. And then we'd have some time of Bible study and then some time of prayer. So in every one of these services, we just kept studying the Bible and trying to learn more about God through studying His Word. Growing up, I had a lot of adults in my life encouraging me and all of us to study the Bible, to memorize the Bible, to really bathe ourselves in the Bible and its stories and the breadth of what God provides there. I mean, it's a pretty amazing thing. A lot of people don't necessarily believe in God or they don't know what to believe about God, but think about it. If there really is a God, wouldn't it be cool if He wrote a book and shared it with us that would explain who He was and how we could interact with Him? And when some people hear that, they think of like the horror stories of a God being demanding, or they've misunderstood things, or taken snippets of the Bible out of context, or they've never studied the Bible. But if you take the time to study the Bible, it's really this incredible story of all that God is doing to reach out to us and how much He loves us. So I feel very privileged to have grown up in a Christian home where going to church and studying the Bible were emphasized. And going to a church where it wasn't just somebody talking about their own opinions or reading popular books or that kind of conversations. It was really, what does God's Word say? And what is He trying to show us about Himself? And what is He showing us about our own lives and how our lives can be richer? So without going into detail, there's lots of different ways the church did that. Which brings me back to Sunday school. Bad name, huh? As a kid, after spending all week in school, who wanted to go to church to go to school again? But that's what we did. And most of the time, when I was growing up, Sunday school was before the main worship service on Sunday. Typically in churches that had Sunday school, which now sadly seems to be a thing of the past, There were age-appropriate classes, so different age groups would study, age-appropriate materials, and we'd learn stories from the Bible again and again as we grew up. Where as we grew up, we would go back and study the stories in more detail. Or, the Bible is huge, so we would, learn new stories or new things about God. As it turns out, one of the ways my mother invested in the community and the church was to teach Sunday school. She taught kindergartners. This is kind of hard to believe, but she taught for over 50 years. So much so that lots of people came up to the church and knew my mom. But also because she taught so long, people started to call her Grandma Mary because they were pretty old and their kids were now going through her class. So it was just a pretty cool thing to see how she had invested there. With that as a role model, I also picked up teaching Sunday school. I did some stuff before I graduated college, but I really started teaching Sunday school when I was in grad school. I was teaching middle schoolers, I think it was. And then after that, I then started teaching some adult classes and then spent most of my life, in retrospect, teaching adult classes. I taught Sunday school in a little different way than some other folks might do it. Most of the time, I would take a scripture, a book of the Bible, and go through it chapter by chapter, verse by verse, and sometimes word by word. So I would find myself reading commentaries, studying the Bible, preparing for the class, praying for the class, and then we would meet together. And that time radically changed my life. I realized that while, when we're growing up, it's tempting to oversimplify the Bible or anything we're teaching kids and make things black and white. And I learned that lots of things in the Bible that are black and white, but there are also many that are not, where there's these ideas of spectrums of like justice or how we should interact with others. And I realized that the Bible is really full of questions, not just answers, and that God, if there's a God and he inspired the Bible, then this God is not afraid of questions. And he's also not afraid of putting something in the Bible that as an author, I wouldn't put in. But in addition to the questions and weird things, I found that there are these scriptures that would just latch on to me, and then I couldn't let them go, or they wouldn't let me go. And they worked on me and worked on me and worked on me and kept showing up week after week, or maybe months or years later, and we'd still be talking about them, and God would still be using them to change our lives. And so I just really fell in love with the Bible and the power of it. And as I taught it, I would sometimes think of it as a movie or try to help someone see the gaps and questions. Because you could be reading a story and all of a sudden this character goes from point A to B and there's this huge gap and you have no idea how they got there. So it's like God did that on purpose so that we would talk about it. And I just found that amazing. And so I would try to do that in our Sunday school class. And it just became an incredible time where God would just meet with us and we would talk through these questions and see how God was working and teaching us. While I was teaching, and maybe more so as I began to think about writing the Onu books and actually began writing them, I found myself asking other people questions about the Bible, things that I kind of took for granted that everyone would just know. And I found out that lots of people would give me this blank stare, even Christians, where they didn't know the stories like I had grown up learning and studying the stories, or even in my adult life, how God had been working in my life through studying and teaching his word. And that made me want to write the Onu books in a way that they would include scriptures and help people really drive back to the scriptures, because God's word is incredible. And I know I mentioned this before in the prologue, but that really was one of the motivating factors for how the books ended up being written. And so what I like to do next is actually start diving more into the books, aspects about the books, and start talking about the Onu and how they represented God and things like that. But I just wanted to give, this brief introduction to some things that were going on in my own life to help set the stage for hopefully make it easier for you to understand what I was trying to write about in the Onu books. So let's get going.